Hi, so this is our pre-reading lecture for our excerpt from Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. We'll be talking about this phenomenon that's referred to as the Great Migration. In order to talk about the Great Migration, which is the choice of millions of African American individuals to leave the South, we're going to talk a little bit about the political and social structure of the Jim Crow South with a mind towards our discussion about public space and public resources as well. And then I'll introduce the idea of the Great Migration that you all will be reading about in greater depth this week. Okay, so Reconstruction, this era that's between 1865 and 1877, is a period that's characterized by the opening of public and political life. So what we begin to see happening here is legislative action with the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that provide access to the right to vote, access to the rights of citizenship, and equal protection under the law for newly emancipated African Americans. So we also see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the first of many that are attempting to create this pathway towards equal participation for African American individuals in the liberties and freedoms that are assured to every American citizen. So what we see happening during this era is not only federal and legislative action, the passage of laws, but we also see African American communities exercising their right to vote and electing members of their community to elected office, right? So African American folks are in Congress, African American folks are representing their communities in the legislative branch of the government for the first time. So this era of opening, both in terms of public life and political life, was happening during the presidency of Ulysses Grant, who we might be familiar with for having been a general for the United States during the Civil War. But this era of Reconstruction comes to an end under the presidency of Rutherford Hayes, who comes to office after Grant. And so what we see happening with the presidency of Hayes is that he essentially kind of bows to the pressures of this white power structure that are lashing back towards this opening and this enfranchisement and this political power of the African American community. So we see individuals who were former slave owners or Southern whites who benefited from a system that put them at the top of the political heap. And so what we see happening is this end to Reconstruction. So it kind of happens in this backroom deal that's super shady. And so President Hayes essentially agrees to end Reconstruction in exchange for settling this very, very close election that he is poised to win. So the Southern Democrats are holding Hayes hostage, essentially. So they're refusing to acknowledge that he won the Electoral College, so they're holding back their delegate votes unless he agrees to end Reconstruction. So Hayes, being a ambitious and spineless political leader, says, okay, I want to be president, so sure, we'll end Reconstruction. And this, can't be sort of underestimated what a huge impact this decision to end Reconstruction brought towards the kind of path of American political history. So what ending Reconstruction means is this reestablishing of quote-unquote home rule. And this is where we get this kind of idea of the power of the states to create their own laws, or that perception of the concept of states' rights. So we see federal troops that were brought into the American South in order to assure African Americans could walk to the polling place and vote safely and make use of public institutions more generally. So these federal troops are removed when Reconstruction is ended, and we see this rebuilding of the power of the states. Okay, then we see another blow towards this attempt to create a pathway towards a more equitable treatment for African Americans in the United States with the 1883 Supreme Court decision that declared the Civil Rights Act of just a few years prior to be unconstitutional. So, what we're seeing happening here is a major change. And I've got a quote here from Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, who was an activist in the late 19th century. So I'll read this aloud. The world has never witnessed such barbarous laws entailed upon a free people as have grown out of the decision of the United States Supreme Court issued October 15, 1883. For that decision alone authorized and now sustains all the unjust discriminations, proscriptions, and robberies, perpetrated by public carriers upon millions of the nation's most loyal defenders. It fathers in all the Jim Crow cars into which people are huddled and compelled to pay as much as the whites, who are given the finest accommodations. It has made the ballot of a black man a parody, his citizenship a nullity, and his freedom a burlesque. It has engendered the bitterest feelings between the whites and blacks and resulted in the death of thousands who could have been living and enjoying life today. So I bring this in to remind us that it wasn't a sort of simple timeline of like the Civil War ended and then the Jim Crow South started. There was this moment, this era called Reconstruction, in which there could have been a different sort of pathway towards the construction of equal protection under the law and freedoms and rights for newly emancipated African Americans, but that is not the way that history went. And so McNeil Turner is sort of reminding us that this has stripped away any of the progress that was made during Reconstruction. Okay, so the Jim Crow South is essentially what is established through this Supreme Court decision. And so what this refers to is the set of local, state, and county laws that essentially codify racial segregation. So they create laws governing the spatial and social segregation of individuals in the American South. And so these laws are beginning to be created in the 1880s when they get the green light from the Supreme Court, and they persist into the 1960s when we see the next set of civil rights laws being passed, which we'll talk about several weeks down the road. And so as we're probably familiar with, these laws impact every kind of public good, right? So public transit, public schools, libraries, bathrooms, anything you can possibly think of. So, for example, these are some laws that I wanted to bring in to give us a sense of the scope of these, of this desire to keep the races separate, right? So it's unlawful for people of different races to play cards together, which we see in this first one here. So don't be playing dice, dominoes, or checkers in public with someone of a different race. Likewise, marriage, something we talked about a little bit in our discussion of the experiences of the Filipino migrant community. So marriage between people of different racial backgrounds was illegal in many, many states throughout the nation. This is just one of the examples here. Segregation of schools, and then as we talked about as well, the segregation of public transit. So right from the big to the small, from the institution of marriage to the playing of games or attending school or riding a train, all are subject to these codes of racial segregation. Okay, so when we're thinking about these state and municipal laws, we are curious to think, so how do these work, right? Are they constitutionally sound? And essentially what happens in 1896 is that the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, essentially establishes another kind of more firm green light for the establishment and the constitutionality of these laws. Okay, so this produces that doctrine that we may have heard of that is separate but equal. So this mandates the creation of separate but equal public accommodations. And as we probably know, right, separate was never equal. African American community institutions were consistently underfunded, neglected, and so we'll also talk about the other kind of byproducts of the establishment of the constitutionality of the laws that we just looked at. Okay, so Plessy versus Ferguson makes both discrimination and segregation legal, essentially. And as if this is not enough, we also begin to see the creation of many different ways to shut African American citizens out of politics as well. So one of the major pushes on the part of the Jim Crow South is to stop African Americans from exercising their right to vote. So we see the creation of a set of really stringent laws, quizzes, poll taxes, and things of that nature that begin to stand in between an African American person and their access to the ballot box. So for example, these are just a few of the insane amount of rules and laws that were specifically designed to exclude African Americans from the right to vote. So the grandfather clause that said that you're only eligible to vote if your ancestors voted before the Civil War. I think we can all figure out what's wrong with that. Right, poll tax, so demanding money for someone to have access to the right to vote, or this idea of creating an insanely challenging literacy test that's only given to African American people trying to go vote. So, like, can you name all the vice presidents and the Supreme Court justices? If you can, then you can vote, right? So we see this kind of creation of not only sort of rules and laws dictating the separation of the races in the South, but we also see this desire to curb the political participation of African American individuals through the creation of more and more obstacles. Okay, so what we also want to pay attention to is what happens outside of what's on the books, right? So all of the laws and issues that I've mentioned so far are kind of officially written down and part of a part of municipal codes and laws. But what we also see happening is that a kind of informal set of rules and etiquette associated with living in the Jim Crow South that create and reiterate this power structure are part of every single kind of social encounter in the South as well. So what this means is that there's an expectation to defer to whites as the kind of social superior in every encounter, right? There's this idea that you must use the sir and ma'am, that you should never socialize in a mixed race context, right? A lot of people kind of talk about sir and ma'am as being some kind of like symbol of the gallantry of the South, but it's actually about this enforcing of a problematic and violent racial hierarchy. And so what we also see happening here is that both the formal and informal laws of the Jim Crow South results in deeply unequal protection under the law. And so what we see happening in the South is any perceived infringement on either the formal or informal rules of the Jim Crow South was met with vigilante violence. And so we probably have read about and heard about this concept of, right, the development of the lynch mob, this vigilante killing, right? So this is essentially producing the conditions of domestic terror for African Americans living in the South. So essentially, there is no recourse there's no protection from the law, right? And so we see this resulting in, right, abductions and murders in very public circumstances without any due process and no legal recourse as well. And I'll link to a story that gives you an example of one of these cases that we may be familiar with as well, just so we have a sense of how this works and what you're up against. So this essentially makes being black in public a very risky proposition in the Jim Crow South. Any gesture, any kind of perceived slight could be interpreted by a member of this vigilante group or by a member of law enforcement as being something that is quote-unquote punishable. So it creates this really extreme form of domestic terror and a lack of safety moving from point A to point B and simply living your life. Okay. And I'll link to this song. This is a song by Billie Holiday that she recorded in 1939 that gives us a kind of real picture of this kind of landscape in the American South as well. So her song Strange Fruit, I'll provide a link to the song. These are the lyrics here for your reference as well. And so she's using her status as a very famous recording artist to talk about the prevalence of lynching in the South, that is the Southern landscape. Okay, so this is a quote from which Isabel Wilkerson gets the title of her book. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. So keep this in mind as we're getting into our discussion of the person that Wilkerson follows in her writing, his choices, his decisions, and his major life decision to leave Louisiana and come to Los Angeles. Okay, so when we're thinking about everything we just saw, everything we just discussed, we want to keep in mind that leaving is sometimes the best way to reject a system that devalues your existence and decides that you don't matter, right? And so this is an excerpt from an anthropologist who's saying that going away is an act of aggressive. It's a way of rejecting the system that dehumanizes you and puts you in danger. Okay, so then finally, this is an overview of the Great Migration. It's a long period, 1915 to 1970, And one thing we'll keep in mind is how the African American press was instrumental in giving people guidance in terms of getting to their final destinations. Okay, that's it. Enjoy the chapter, and we'll talk more.